Once the outbreak of war began in 1914, it didn't take long for the western front of the battle to become a war of attrition. Attrition means that you basically try to wear down your enemy by lasting longer than they do. And this is going to happen in a couple different ways, but it will mostly be because of trench warfare, which we'll get to in just a second. It doesn't take long before the war becomes a multi-front battle. Series of battles rather. And by 1914 you have primarily a two-front war that happens with the Western Front here along the Belgium-French border that's mostly in forest. And then on the eastern part you have the battle between primarily Germany and Russia. You do have technically a Balkan front down here in the south, but the only real area that we really focus on in this PowerPoint is Gallipoli, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Not long into the war in 1914, you have Western and allies that include France and Great Britain who have teamed up together to provide a pretty strong defensive in the forest of France and Belgium. And of course they are on the one side, and the German troops for the most part are on the other side with some help from some of the other Central Powers. What you see here in the line you should pay the most attention to is the orange line, and that's really what you're going to have as a stabilized front for much of the 4 years that World War II occurs. The red line there toward the back will eventually be the armistice line when the war ends. Along the Western Front, you will have eventually a type of warfare known as trench warfare, and some of you guys are familiar with this from U.S. history, but essentially you have both sides digging in for the long haul in a series of trenches that would include areas like the frontline trench and then your reserve trenches back here. And the goal, of course, would be to send your men over the top, as they would call it, through no man's land. If you could get through the barbed wire, the grenades, the landmines, the poison gas, and of course the rifle fire, then you would have the opportunity to jump into your enemy's trench line back here and hopefully not get bayoneted to death. As you can probably guess, this was not terribly successful, and it resulted in quite a bit of loss of life and, of course, wounded. 9 times out of 10, it seemed that once an opposing side was able to take over the other side's trench, they were only able to hold it for a few days before that side decided to come back and regain their trench. So it really becomes evident after a few months on the Western Front that this is what the war is going to be. It's going to be a war of attrition. Who can last longest in these trench conditions? Believe it or not, this area in Belgium and France was at one point a very beautiful forest. Most of that will be destroyed during the course of the war, and what you get by really the end of the first year, is a fighting location that is essentially always muddy, lack of any real natural beauty, and you have men that are fighting in these conditions for day after day, month after month, year after year, and it becomes really that war of attrition on who can hold out and whose trench line can be the most secure, and basically who can keep sending men to the Western Front and hopefully survive. One of the major battles on the Western Front occurred in February of 1916, or began rather in February of 1916, and that is the Battle of Verdun. This was a German offensive in which the goal supposedly was to, quote, bleed the white out of the French. That's what the German soldiers were told. They wanted to get past Verdun and then get back to Paris. When this conflict was eventually over by that summer, each side had about 500,000 casualties. This was also, should be noted, the first time that the German military used a group known as stormtroopers. The Battle of the Somme in July of 1916 was a battle that the goal basically was to try to direct the German troops away from Verdun to basically distract them and get them to focus on Somme, which was further up the trench line. Unfortunately, this battle includes a day in which 60,000 British soldiers were killed in one single day. That still is a record, so to speak, within British military history. Over the course of 5 months in which this battle happened, you lost 1 million lives, if you include all the sides and casualties. This also includes civilians killed in the way. When this was all said and done, how much ground was actually gained by one side versus the other? 12 kilometers. That's it. The British in particular lost 420,000 men, and the French lost 200,000 men. One of the horrors of this war, of course, was the fact that you have new machinery that is introduced, and unfortunately that reaps quite a bit of new levels of devastation. The machine gun was actually developed by a British man who introduced it to the British government and said, hey, do you guys want to buy a contract in this? Would you like to mass produce this weapon? And the British at the time felt like it was too barbaric and not something they wanted to be associated with, because they still believed that war could have some type of honor with it and I guess chivalry, if you will. But they passed on the technology, and this guy, being ultimately a businessman, introduced the technology to the German government, and the German government was more than willing to take on the patent and to produce the product. So the Germans, at the outbreak of World War I, have, amongst other things in their arsenal, the machine gun. And you start to, of course, get mass casualties as part of that. You start to get quite a bit of wounded that are dealing with wounds that have not been seen in previous warfare. And now you have an entire generation of men who are coming back with either limbs missing or, as you see in the bottom here, parts of their face missing. And so that's a whole new challenge for these countries. One thing that should be pointed out as well is that when these young men are coming back, we don't have the veteran services in many of these countries as we do now. And even the idea of prosthetic limbs is still a relatively new science. And so you have this growth industry, I guess, as far as making prosthetics is concerned. But you also have, like I said, this entire generation that's coming back and dealing with much different things than they expect going into the war. And now they have to try to reacclimate to a life that they never would have thought they were going to have to live. And now society is attempting to adopt them back in, and they really don't fit in. And this is going to cause social problems well into the 1920s and 1930s in Europe.